Welcome to this class once again. We're continuing a JavaScript class basically, and we've talked a lot recently. And we've talked about our last class was about objects, and this class is going to be about functions. Functions in JavaScript. I would like to go back to the text editor. This was where we left off in the last class. So let me just open the console so that you would get to see what we're doing. So we were using our we stopped at conditionals. Yes, we're done with objects, now conditionals. And we talked about the if and else if statements, and also the else statement in the last class. So I'll just I'll leave all these things here, but first off, let me leave it first. I'll just the console. I'll just comment it out. I just want this block of code to be here. So for instance, now, so our class is, I'm really getting many things happening. It's about functions. We'll be talking about functions. So functions. What are functions? The simple definition is just what is the definition or description of them is they are a block of code that does a specific task. That's just what they are. That's what they are. They are a block of code that does a specific task, and they help you organize your code and help you to be able to reuse a certain kind of code over and over and over and over again. For instance, this block of if statements and else if statements we already created. If, for instance, we want to do something similar to this, we would have to, and let's say after we've written some lines of code down here, if we want to do similar thing with this, like this if block that we wrote here, we would have to come down here and still rewrite it if we want to do the same compilation. What am I saying? The same logic. We'll still need to rewrite the code, and this makes our code unnecessarily long and can even prevent makes there will be errors that you could have easily prevented. So functions allow you to write a reusable chunk of code that you can always call back once and again, and that's what makes programming a lot more, makes functions make your programming journey a lot more easy, and it's excellent or wonderful if you can learn to use functions, and it's actually a paramount thing that you learn to use as you go as a programmer. It's not difficult, and I'll just create a comment section, a multi-line comment, so that I'll just describe what functions are. And okay, so to write a function, you start with the function keyword like this. Then you give your function a name, and this name follows the same convention as variables. Yeah, the same convention as the kind of rules and names that you can use for variables, the same thing. So just think of it like you're giving a variable name. But one of the things I like doing when naming functions is I like the name to be descriptive, so that it will tell as much as possible, so that when you see this function, you know exactly what it does. Then you open and put a bracket like this, then you write your function, your your code here, or block of code that will be executed when the function is called. And some functions could have parameters here inside of it, which serve as local variables within this block. So the parameters could be something like, I'm just giving you an example so that you know what we're talking about. So this is how a function actually looks like. It's not so complex or difficult, and these parameters now serve as arguments when calling the function. So there is a lot of theory that I've just downloaded down your throats. So let's just get into business and we'll talk about and use a function. So first, let's create a function that will multiply a number by itself, so that I'll be able to use once and once again. How do we go about doing that? The square of, let's take the square of a number. So let's say, and how do we go about this? We just explained, we'll go with a function. Function. If you notice, because the keyword, the color changed because of my text editor. I don't know if that happens in yours. Then we give it a name. I said square. Then, and as you can see, we've already declared the function. So we put whatever code we want to display within this, we want to run within this place. So let's say we want a local variable. Let's a, and what we want to do is a multiply by a. So let me make it one liner so that it will not be too complex. So what I want is result equals a multiplied by a. That is just what this code does. It multiplies itself and will now print to the console results. As simple as this. That is what it does. But if you notice, there is no way to get our how would I put it? There's no way to get our variables what is a into it. So that's where parameters come in. So we could now put a as a parameter here. That is, whatever we pass in as an argument gets multiplied by itself, and our result is printed on the console. So how do we now call a function or use this function? It's called calling or invoking a function. So how do we invoke this function or use it? Because we've just written a block of code that takes in an argument, which is a, and multiplies it by itself and prints out the results in the console. Basically, this is a function. We've done a function. Good. But how do we use it? How does this wonderful reusable chunk of code that we've written become really useful to us? It's simple. We'll just come and say square this. Then if we know, if you notice, it's giving us any, so we know that we have to pass an argument. So let's say we want to get the square of 3. So we want to get the square of 3. How do we do this? So just simply when we run this code, what happens is this: we call the square with the argument 3. A becomes 3. So what happens is it goes, result will now become 3 multiplied by 3, and this result will now be passed out in the console. So let's go to the console and see if we are getting the result we are supposed to get. So let's refresh, and we are getting 9. So if you notice, what we just did was call square or invoke square with the result. So let's see, to prove to you that this can be used over and over again, we can now say square and put in another parameter, maybe 23, and save, and go back to our console, refresh. It will give you 5 to 9. So basically, if you can see, we didn't need to write this whole set of logic again. We just wrote it once, and we are able to keep reusing this by calling or invoking our function as many times as we need to. That is the beauty of functions here. That is the beauty of function. You could just write it once, and you can keep reusing it and keep reusing it over and over again. So here in this case is I would say a simple explanation of function, but I want us to do something with this our if block that we talked about. So I want us to convert it into a function. So what I'll just do is just copy it. I'll cut it actually. Then okay, let me leave it. I'll just copy rather than cut. Then I'll just let this whole block of code become a comment so that you have it. I want you to have something to reference back on. Just copy it and I'll paste it down here. So now this whole our if block, we want it to become a function. How do we go about doing this? All we just have to do is come here and write well, let me just cut it first so that we'll just start with the skeleton. So I'll say function, then we call it, let's say calculator, just something short, calculator. Then we now paste that code block here, and this time we'll just so here now, if you notice, we are now getting all these things inside our function. But how do we get sign and var1 and var2 into this function? Like I said, we'll go get them into the parameter. So we could just go var1, var2, then sign, and this becomes our 3 parameters that goes in when we call our function. And as you can see, simple, we can now reuse this block of code as many times as we want. So for instance, let's say we want to calculate the how will I put it? I want to calculate a number or add a number. Sorry, because I changed it to calculator. I want to add a number. I'll just comment this out. So we'll just call the function calculator, and we know we have 3 parameters we have to pass in. So the first to be, let's say, 23 plus 35. Let me arrange it so that it will be more intuitive. So I'll just put sign in the middle. So that it will be more intuitive. Plus then let's say plus 45. So when we save this and we'll go back to our console, we'll get the answer already printed on the console, which is 68. And all we just needed to do is just call this function. Now we can just keep calling it and we keep getting results. Let's say we call it with a different number. Let's say 80. Sorry, 80 this time. Rather than using plus, let's use minus. 80 minus 45. Let's go to our function. Sorry, kind of failed to be called. We have 35. 80 minus 45 gives us 35, and you can see we can keep calling it and using that. Let me just try one more time with the multiplication. Let's do the multiplication this time, and you see all we just have to do is call this function and it keeps giving us our answer over and over and over and over again without us needing to write this block of code again. We just convert it into a function and just keep calling it and keep calling it. And one thing we can actually do to make our function a lot more, how would I call it, a lot more I don't want to use functional, is there's something called the return word. The return keyword, let me just talk about it quickly. It's return. The return keyword allows our function to end. For instance, when we use the addition here, our function came here and checked if sign is the addition, then it executed this and printed these results to the console, and it just printed these results to the console. But when we use a return keyword, for instance, it stops execution at this point since this condition is fulfilled, and our function now returns something that we can store in a variable, or returns a value that we can store in a variable. So if the same way, if our function, so our function, let me explain, or let me try and look for an easier way to explain it. When we use the return word, when our function encounters that word, like it comes about return, if you notice, after the return, everything under it within that block of code turned another color, because basically anything under it would not execute. Our function ends where the return word ends. That is just a way to terminate our function. And that's, instead of printing to the console, I would like us to return whatever is our result to, let's say, a variable we saved it into. So let me just comment this whole thing out. Let me just comment this whole thing out. So let's convert all these places we were printing the result to the console to return the result rather. And finally, so now if we try to run our function now the same way we would run it here, so I'll just copy this after we've changed this thing to return keyword. It's going to give us the same answer, but if we go check on the console, nothing will display. Why? Because in this case it will come add 45, 23 and 45 here and return the results. It will return the result here, but since we don't have a way to catch this result, we are not going to see it. So for a good way to do it is we'll just say let's put a variable to it. Let's name the variable answer. And now what happens is, if this calculator function of ours solves this task we've given to it, it returns the result and stores it in this answer. Then we can now print this answer and we'll get our results there. This is a more practical way of how you can use a function. So we are returning the results. So we are not outrightly printing it out to the console. Then we save it in a variable and we can do whatever we want with that result that's already saved in this variable called answer. We can print it out, we can get the answer and still multiply it with something. Just watch. So now when we get to the console and we reload, we get our 68 because it's coming from line 242. So you see it's coming from this line 242. That's where we are actually printing to the console. So that's that about the return keyword. It's better to use it. You can, when you need your whatever is coming out, the solution or the result from your function, you can save it into a variable and then use it to do something else rather than just printing outrightly to the console. Because in a real function where you're writing your code, you need your results to do something, not just to just print to the console. Printing to the console is just for us to debug and as well as for learning in this class. So this is a more functional way of writing your function, if I use that word, functional function. So basically that's the return word for you, the return keyword for you. So Next on our agenda with functions, I would like us to um, see if there's a way we could, okay, tweak our function a little bit. I don't want to make it a little bit okay, let's just leave it like that. Let's not complicate it. Let's just leave it the way it is. So we've talked about functions, and we've been able to define a function. We've been able to also invoke a function, and we've talked about um, return keyword in a function. So like I explained in our class on conditionals, where I told you about the result here that we are declaring being a local variable. It's the same thing applies within a function as well. Here they are all local variables. The result is a local variable independent of each of the else block in which you see it. So also within a function, you can have another local variable. You can have as many local variables as possible, which only exist within this functional scope. And this we can define. To define local variable, we use the let keyword, like I already explained. So we can say let a local, or local, and we just define it as a local variable. And basically, don't get confused, because I know you probably do some research and you get to meet local and global scope variables. So within a function, they can be local variables. These are local variables, and they act within the scope of that function. So don't get it all mixed up, because we didn't talk about it. But just the same way that we have these local variables within this if block within a function, and so we can have local variables, and depending on the kind of what you're doing with your function, or what problem you're trying to task you're trying to execute with that function. So don't get it all twisted. And like we explained about the var and the let keywords, declaring a variable with let makes it scope sensitive or scoped variable, because it can only be present within the scope within which you let it to be. So if I declare let result here, this result is different from the result we have here, because this one is a more global scope, because we can use it. It's outside of the function, but it can be used inside of the function. Don't mind that. So we can say result, and here we are calling this result, not this result. And we can now change the value. But if you notice, we can take the value from this result, do something within it inside here, and return an answer to whatever we want to do. So basically, when we use the let keyword here, the variable becomes global. But for instance, if we use the var keyword even inside of a function and declare something, result to, I'm gonna use something else so that I will not confuse you. Terms, and we declare a variable called terms. For instance, this variable is it's supposed to be within scope, but because we use the var keyword, it is now, we can also access it outside of the functional scope. And that's the difference between the var and the let. One is scoped, the other is not scoped. So I just felt I should clarify that before we move on. I think this is all we can take on functions for now. I would encourage you to write a couple more functions, and try and get some muscle memory about it. And as we progress, we'll probably use it more, since we've already exposed ourselves to it or talked about it. So we'll use it more in our coding experience as we go on. So thank you, and this is the end of this class on functions.